If you're buying a new mountain bike, perhaps you've never bought one at all, or perhaps you just need some extra tips in these confusing modern times when there's so many categories under just mountain biking, and sizing can be a letter based on reach rather than just measurements of your seat tube like it used to be. Well, don't worry, because I'm going to explain all in this video, and do hit subscribe if you want more tips like this in the future. People often ask me what is the best bike brand to buy, and this is really subjective. There's a hard answer there because different brands offer different things. Now, some brands will offer a really broad spectrum of bikes, like Canyon, for example, whereas other brands like Propane, for example, might hone into more of a gravity niche and not do cross-country, so that might affect your decision. Also, some brands sell direct and some sell in bike shops. So if they were to sell direct, you may get a bit of a saving by not having to pay for a bike shop. But if you value human opinion and setting you up on your new bike, then maybe you want to pick a brand that's in a shop. There are also women-specific bikes out there. Now, some brands will offer a women-specific model, or perhaps they'll update a men's bike with a different paint job and some women-specific touch points, which means grips and handlebars. But there are some brands out there that are completely dedicated to women, and they change up the geometry and the shock tune on the mountain bike. Now, I have done a specific video on women-specific bikes, so do check that out, as I'll go into way more detail if that is a consideration for you. So if you're planning to race cross-country or any off-road sportifs, or perhaps you want to be doing some general mountain bike riding out in the bridleways in the countryside, then you're probably going to want a cross-country bike. Now, most of these bikes will come with 100 mils of suspension. A lot of the time, you might be looking at a hardtail. So, for example, this is a hardtail because it has no rear suspension. If you wanted a full suspension to give yourself a little more comfort in the rear, then often these cross-country bikes will come with 100 in the front or 100 in the rear. Now, these days, bikes do go up to 120 mils of suspension. Some of these will be race bikes, and they might have very aggressive geometry that leans you forward into a racy position. But some of those 120 mil full suspension bikes will be what we class as downcountry bikes. Now, downcountry bikes can be cross-country bikes too, but they tend to have slightly slacker geometry, more confidence-inspiring and more comfortable geometry for long day rides. So they are great for long distance riding and cross-country riding, but they're also great for marathon racing if you're into that. If you're going to be seeking out single track or mucking around in the woods, then perhaps a trail bike is for you. Now, even a trail bike has a bit of a broad bracket because it can go from 120 mil up to 150 mil. Generally, now there is no hard and fast rule, but the more travel you have, the more it is oriented towards descending rather than climbing. The shorter travel ones may be better for long distance trail riding, and the longer travel ones might be better for trail center descending. Now, a trail bike may look like a small step up from a downcountry bike or a full sus cross-country bike, but they tend to be a little heavier than downcountry bikes because they're not as weighted towards the climbing as much, but that heaviness tends to give you a little extra robust strength and durability, which is much better if you're thrashing it around the woods. And then there's the Enduro bike, which is another step up from the trail bike. Whereas the trail bike has to go up and down and along, then the Enduro bike focuses its energy on the descents. But perhaps you're climbing quite slowly and carefree, which is what an Enduro race is all about. So these bikes will tend to be 150 up to 170 mils of travel. They are almost always full suspension bikes, and they can come in big wheels with the 29ers, or they can come in 27.5 front and rear like I've got here, or they can even be in mixed wheel sizes where you have big up the front and smaller at the back. And again, this is another step up from trail in that they tend to be a little heavier, but they are a lot more durable, and the geometry will be very slack and very oriented towards going downhill. Keep an eye out for park and freeride specific bikes if you want to be doing freeriding or big hucks and jumps in the bike park. And also keep an eye out for downhill bikes, which are very specific to downhill racing. They will have much longer forks, perhaps dual crown and triple clamp forks. And they will also have very small cassettes on the rear, which doesn't make them any good for pedaling other than downhill. Now, once you've found the brand that you like and the model that aligns with your riding needs, you will be met with a few more options. You will be met with models that come at different price points. Now, usually a bike will increase in price as the spec increases. So you might expect to get better suspension, better components, maybe lighter components, but more expensive doesn't necessarily mean better. So the better spec may not necessarily be better for you. And just to illustrate that, something like a top spec SRAM Eagle or a top spec Shimano XTR, they use far more expensive materials like, for example, titanium in their cassettes and their parts. And this is an expensive material, which is why the components are expensive. And they use this to make the components a lot lighter. However, it's not as durable as something like aluminium and steel. So something like a Shimano XT, for example, doesn't use titanium. It uses more steel and a little bit of aluminium. So it is more hard wearing and it is more affordable than the top spec XTR model. So just to prove that maybe you want to go for durability over lightweight, and there are differences there. Now, once you pick the model that you want, and perhaps you've even aligned the spec with your budget, another thing to consider is the frame material. Now, these will give you different ride qualities usually. The carbon is a far more timely and more expensive process to manufacture a frame with, but manufacturers can build in different characteristics. Perhaps they can make it stiffer, or perhaps they can make it more comfortable. Different brands will offer you different things. So do look into what they're offering with the carbon. Sometimes they may even give you added benefits like tool storage or storage in your down tube, whereas aluminium doesn't always give you that. But what aluminium does offer you is a little bit more to play with your budget. So generally an aluminium frame can be a lot more affordable, a lot less expensive than a carbon frame. You may even be able to save up to £1,000 or $1,000. As a mountain biker in the market for a brand new bike, you've probably asked yourself that age-old question, should I buy a hardtail or a full suspension bike? Now, much like frame material, going for a full suspension bike over a hardtail is going to add money to that bike. It is going to be more expensive, maybe even in excess of £1,000 or $1,000 over the hardtail equivalent of the same spec. And the reason being is because of all the complexity in designing that rear suspension and also adding extra things like the rear shock. Now, whether you should choose one or the other might depend on what genre you have gone for. So, for example, if you're racing short distances for cross country, a hardtail that's nice and light might be absolutely fine. But I personally find them to be quite fatiguing if I'm doing more than 3 or 4 hours of riding. So be that a consideration. When it comes to trail riding and enduro, I do actually have a trail hardtail, and because it's light, it's very versatile. It can ride all day if I want it to, and it can race enduro, but it's never going to be as fast or as comfortable as a full suspension bike. So there is that to consider, but perhaps let your wallet guide you in the first place. So just to give you a real life example, this Canyon Exceed CF6 is $2,349, whereas a full sus Lux, although it is a slightly different model, it is the same spec, and that costs £3,199. So that is an extra £850 for the full sus. If you're going to get at least one thing right, make that one thing the size of your bike. And that's why it's a great idea to start your journey in a bike shop, because you can try on different sizes and see what fits you best. You can also speak to the staff to find out whether your favorite brands are holding any demo days, so you can actually try your mountain bike out on the trails. If you're buying online, make sure you look at the brand's or the model's geometry chart, and it should give you an idea of what size is best for your height. However, if you want to compare your new bike to your old bike, you can go on websites like geometrygeeks.bike and compare each model against each other and work out if your new bike would be longer or shorter or slacker or steeper. Now, what's more important than choosing the right spec level for you is looking at those individual components and working out whether they meet your needs. Because if you have to change handlebars or brakes along the way, for example, it's going to cost you more money in the long run rather than buying something that's suitable for you right away. And we've also talked about the spec of your drivetrain. So, for example, going for the top spec isn't necessarily better, it's just different. It may be more expensive materials, and it might be that it gives you something lighter, but it might actually wear out quicker, which means that you'll have to replace it a lot. And if you're replacing like for like, this can get quite expensive. So do look at the components individually and work out if they meet your needs. So you're happy with the drivetrain spec that you've chosen, but are the chain rings suited to your style of riding? So what I mean is, if you're quite sprinty and powerful, you may get away with something like a 34 tooth or a 32 tooth, maybe even bigger if you're racing cross country and you have a nice light bike. But if you're the sort of person who likes to spin a really nice easy gear, perhaps you're winching up really long fire roads to tackle some nice descents on your trail or enduro bike, then you're going to want something smaller up front, so potentially 32 or 30. You can also go bigger on the back with the cassette. Maybe a 50 tooth or bigger at the back will give you a nice spinny easy gear. So this is something you can obviously change if your bike that you've chosen doesn't have that gear ratio that's right for you, but you are looking at potentially around £50 or more for the chainring at the front, potentially 100 or even more with the cassette at the back to change it. So this is where you want to start looking at the sort of spec and the finer details that are coming on that new bike. When you're looking at brakes on your new bike, there's usually two things to consider, and that's your brake rotor size and also how many pistons are in your calipers. Now, the pistons are the pistons that actuate the pads onto your disc rotors, and the more you have, the more power you will get from your brakes, which is great for things like trail and enduro, but bigger or more isn't necessarily better. It's just better for gravity-oriented sports or for heavier riders that need the extra grabbing power. If you were, say, riding a cross-country bike or you're taking your trail bike on long-distance jaunts, then potentially a big rotor or more pistons and more power might actually be detrimental to the performance, and perhaps you won't need it. And maybe you're even wasting a bit of your budget on the more blingy performance brakes. One overlooked component on the frame is the bottom bracket. So you often get a press fit or a threaded, and your frame will be specific for either of those two. Now, a press fit is something that's pressed into your frame so that your cranks can go through, and the threaded means that it threads into the frame for your cranks to then go through. Now, the threaded bottom bracket has its bearings on the outside, so they tend to be bigger, they run nice and freely, they're really well sealed, and that tends to be better for people who are riding in wet and mucky conditions, whereas the press fit is often open to the elements and can get a lot of water ingress and need regular maintenance or replacing. However, the benefits of press fit is that it's a lot lighter, so you will often get those on a cross-country bike, and I wouldn't worry too much if you're riding in good conditions. Wheel size is something that I think people agonize over a little too much. It is personal preference. You won't know what suits you until you find it. So it would be great if you could go to a demo day and try the same model with different wheel sizes and see what works for you. But the general rule of thumb is 29er, or the bigger wheels, are for speed, and 27.5, or the smaller wheels, are for agility. So most downcountry and cross-country bikes will be 29er because they're all about the speed. Trail and enduro bikes may give you the option of either 29er or full 27.5 like I have here, or you might even have mixed wheel, which means smaller in the back and bigger at the front. Now, if you were thinking that you need something strong, you want to do some jumps, maybe even thinking about doing some style and some tricks, smaller wheels will be more agile on the ground, but also in the air because there's less resistance to inertia when you try and turn the bike. 29ers are very quick and they will be confidence inspiring over rough terrain because those big wheels will roll over technical terrain really easily. However, sometimes they can be a little bit of a fight in the corners because they're harder to turn. But that is a very general rule of thumb there. So give that a bit of thought and see what you think works for you. Suspension really is so good right now that you shouldn't worry too much about the spec that you're getting on your bike. Buy within your budget, because the difference between low end and top end suspension here is perhaps slightly different internals on the top spec and also more adjustability, more dials. But if you're not confident with setting up suspension and customizing suspension, then all of those dials may be lost on you anyway. And so you shouldn't feel bad about going for a lower end. It's still going to perform really, really well. And also, most brands these days, most forks and models can actually be upgraded over time. So you can change some of these internals. You may even be able to add dials later on down the line if you feel like your riding has progressed and you want to tune that even more. So there's my big tips on buying a brand new bike. But one final tip is don't forget to factor in things like pedals, which don't usually come with the bike, and also helmets, shoes, and anything else that you need to start riding in your new bike and your new genre, because these things add up and that will take a big chunk of your overall budget as well. But hopefully that has helped you. But if I have missed anything, let me know down in the comments below. What are your big tips on buying a brand new bike? Is there something you always look for in your new bike? Let me know down in the comments below and help out that future GMBN community.